Good evening, and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. And as you know, if you watch this show regularly, we always try to be current and talk to people who know what's going on in Chicago, and around the country, and around the world. So tonight I'm very happy to have as our special guest, Bruce Dold, the editorial page editor of the Chicago Tribune. Bruce, thank you so much for coming back and seeing us.
You're breaking your string of having people in who know what's going on, but that's okay.
Well, at least people who speak as though they know what's going on, right? You can present yourself well. So first of all, thank you for being here. And there's so many topics we could cover because the world is so complicated. So let's start with, because you're a newspaper guy and you've been a newspaper person all your life, let's talk about the news generally. It's changing. The way news is reported is changing with different media coming into play. But one of the criticisms that keeps coming up for the news, both from the political right and the political left, is it's biased and it doesn't tell the whole story. And I'm sure you guys get hit from both sides saying, oh, well, you didn't tell this side, and the other side says, oh, you didn't tell our side. Every day.
From both sides.
So balancing that is really tough. But one of the Tribune's sister publications, the Los Angeles Times, the editor recently came out and stated publicly that he was not going to publish letters to the editor that denied the fact of climate change. His argument being, well, science really has reached a consensus on this, and we in the newspaper business are in the business of printing known facts as best as we can ascertain them, and so we're not going to publish letters that deny climate science. So well, is that a good idea? Is that a bad idea? What do you think?
I wouldn't do
that?
Nick Goldberg is the editorial page editor in LA. He's a good friend. He's a brilliant guy. I really like him a lot. We argue about a lot of different things. I think, from what I understand in that case, he is saying, as we would, that we fact-check letters. So if there's something that we know is factually incorrect, we're not going to run it. Now, that tends to be numbers, names, if you claims that are demonstrably false. I think in the case of global warming, there is an active debate on this. I probably share your view on it.
Just the cause of it.
Well, you could say there is a political debate. Look, there's an argument right now on whether global warming halted over the last several years, and so maybe we don't have the problem that we think. I'm just saying it's an argument. But that's the kind of debate that's going on right now. So I think to halt that kind of debate by saying we're only going to print what we believe to be factually true on this. And as we were saying earlier, look, I probably wouldn't run a letter that said the Earth was flat. That's sort of settled science.
Yeah.
Global warming, in a lot of ways, it is settled science, but the political debate still goes on how you should respond to it, how extensive it is. So I think you run into trouble if you start trying to pick and choose on that basis.
Well, but in a more general case, though, how do you determine what's factual? I mean, obviously, no one has perfect knowledge on any particular subject. But if you want to publish things that are factual, how do you ever know if you're correct? And if you're trying to screen out...
If you're in doubt, you don't run it. We run a lot of... I'd say the letters editor at the Tribune has the largest army of amateur writers in the world. We get 1,500 letters a week, and when we're choosing them, we do try to be careful on that. If you have a question, you just don't use it. But we will call up the writer and say, "What's your source on things?" We do that often with op-ed writers as well. You've got enough material that you don't have to take a chance on something like that, and it does go to your credibility on what you choose to run. Now, a lot of what you run and letters, is opinion. You get a little nervous when you get people who are making, 35 claims in a letter, factual claims, and so that might make you a little nervous. But a lot of the stuff you're writing really is sort of debate on issues of the day.
So the fact-checking with the letters is about the same as a fact-checking would be on an article that's being run in the newspaper?
Yes.
Okay, so same level, same kind of scrutiny. So taking that example a little to one side, the New York Times recently ran an article on voter ID laws, something near and dear to my heart. As you know, I spent years working with the elections department for Cook County. And the article said, it was talking about actually Judge Posner, who had said that he had made a mistake in validating the Indiana voter ID laws. He said he would not do it today. So at any rate, in the article, it was described as really just a political debate. Said, well, Republicans say that voter fraud is rampant and these voter ID laws are necessary to prevent that fraud. Democrats say, no, that fraud doesn't exist, and this is just a matter of voter suppression. And the way that was positioned in the article, it just sounded like a political debate. Well, Republicans say this, Democrats say that. But in fact, it would be possible to go out and empirically measure that, how much voter fraud does exist based on phony IDs. People come in saying, I'm not who I am.
I suppose you can measure how much voter fraud is detected. We know the number of cases that are brought, the number of challenges that are brought. I don't think we probably don't know the number, the extent of fraud that's undetected.
Right.
You know, Cook County has a long history in this. Now, we have a whole different election system, ballot counting system than we had 30, 40 years ago. So I'm sure, thanks to your good work, that it's much more difficult to carry out a fraud. But I don't know that have we eradicated it? I wouldn't be ready to go there.
But
so I think the ballot fraud issue, does become and I think it's, aside from the fraud, I think the question of the political debate in part is, should you or should you not have to demonstrate you are who you say you are when you go to vote? Is a minimum requirement, is it a requirement to get a state identification card onerous? It's not a reading test, it's not a literary test, the kind of things that were so blatantly racist that were done in the South. And so I think that's where the political debate comes in.
Which I think is completely valid, and that political debate is unsettled, as you noted earlier. But my question is really more about whether research can be done on something that can be empirically shown one way or the other. And I use this just because I happen to know something about elections and voter fraud statistics. But it would apply in any case, rather than to say, and I think the news media generally, not just the Tribune, every news media, in the effort to be balanced, frequently says, well, these guys say this, these other guys say that.
That's why I got out of reporting. I mean, well, I was a reporter for 12 years and I covered politics, and it was one of the more frustrating things about it was covering political debate, where you had a point of view, you had to suppress that point of view, you had to bend over backwards to be objective in what you did. So I loved doing that, but when I went on the editorial board, when I became an opinion writer, it was freeing in a way, because you do have certain views, opinions, and you are freer to express them, and part of that is who you think is right or wrong on a particular political issue.
So if I understand you correctly, so from an editorial perspective, an opinion perspective, you can talk about whether or not the facts support one argument or the other. But from a strict reporting, that would not apply? Is that correct?
You need, if Democrats are throwing out something that's complete nonsense, they're still saying it, you know? And I think you do have an obligation to report, this is the Democratic perspective on an issue. You can't silence it. You shouldn't silence it.
But should you put a caveat around it? Say this is what
to
they're
say
saying.
It's not. Oh, by the way, it's nonsense.
Well, or just say.
That's not a reporter's responsibility. That's.
But wouldn't
that's
it be
where
to
you.
say,
That's where you run the risk of introducing bias, I think.
But wouldn't it be to say, oh, but independent research or whatever research we have access to would say something else?
Well, you got to give me. Do you have an example?
Well, I go back to voter fraud because I know something about that. So my experience after many years with the county clerk's office is that voter fraud based on voter ID, that is pretending I'm someone else when I come to vote, essentially doesn't exist in the United States. The number of cases are so minuscule it's hard to measure them. So that problem, which is the only type of voter fraud that's addressed by these voter ID laws, really doesn't exist. So that can be empirically measured. And to my mind, if a story is about that the story should at least say, well, by the way, empirical measurements have shown over the years that the amount of this fraud is this tiny percentage. And that's not taking a side or another. That's just saying, look, here's what our facts, as we've been able to ascertain them, show.
And there may be stories that would do that. I think maybe a good example is, the president's birth certificate. You needed to explain. There's a whole birther crowd that's out there saying a certain thing. What do we know about that? And I think the press did go to pains to say, there is a birth certificate. It's in Hawaii. They're producing it in Hawaii.
We've seen it.
Right. So that wasn't particularly difficult to prove. I think where you're going with yes, if there is certain evidence, oftentimes though that evidence is being gathered by one side or another. People have a particular, in the vote fraud case, you have to judge the source of what's considered the empirical evidence, and I think we do. Polling is a good example. There's polling, there's newspaper polling, independent polling is done, there's party polling that's done. You got to be careful to always explain. When a poll says candidate X is at 62%, make sure you say that candidate X paid for the poll. So I said there are facts and there are factoids, truthiness.
Yes, truthiness, right. The great formulation. All right, so as you go through trying to work with the facts and trying to figure out what really is worth reporting and what isn't, and you get this pressure from both sides, each side saying, well, you're not reporting our side of the story. How do you toe that middle? Where do you decide that middle ground lies? And does it shift over time, or does it shift based on politics or based on something else?
Well, I mean, it depends on each issue, each day's news cycle. I'm not sure that that there's not a template for.
There's not like a philosophy or something. It's really, really, is it kind of like as it comes?
I think it is, and particularly when you're covering politics, because so much of politics really is sort of bending debate. So again, I say it's difficult to say that there are some templates, some rules of the road on when you're going to. You do have to be careful that you don't stifle debate. You may think someone is
crazy,
a loon, but you're going to give an example. Dick Durbin. Dick Durbin puts up on Facebook that a Republican member of Congress said he can't stand the sight of the president. He got caught, and well, it didn't happen. The White House denied it. The Republicans denied it. I think that's the kind of thing where the press.
Durbin's standing by it. At least
he said the last thing he did was he went up on Facebook and said he appreciated the clarification from the president. It's time to move on. So there's a case. All right.
Yeah.
If you didn't believe that fact, would you not report that he said it? It was out there. We reported it. We went to the White House and got, and that's a case where sort of there are not perfect ways to search for the truth. And in that case, who knows? Maybe it was said. Somehow that story got circulated, and I think we're still trying to figure out what really happened there.
Something less than stated and more than nothing is my guess.
Yeah.
No, that makes sense to me, and I do understand that approach. And I think, in fact, if we go back years to Dan Rather reporting about President Bush's National Guard service, and he had a document in front of him that turned out later to be forged. But in an effort, well, I think because of his own beliefs and his own particular point of view, he accepted that as truth without necessarily doing the requisite fact-checking after the fact or before reporting it. So that's a case where you
the
just
old saying
get ahead.
in Chicago journalism: if your mother says she loves you, check it out. And
Right.
I think what that what that means is you should have a skepticism about the people you trust, your own sources. We've got a good example now with the Al Story Simon case. You've got a double murder on the South Side. A person is convicted of that murder. A lot of good journalism goes into proving that the person who was convicted was innocent. Another person confesses to the case. First person is let out of jail. Second person is put in jail. Everybody thinks this is a heroic story. We know exactly what happened here. Now, today, years later, we're looking around and we're finding out, well, maybe the second person was coerced into a confession. And, I mean, there's a case where this was a case that was instrumental in Illinois abolishing the death penalty, in George Ryan freeing death row. It may not have happened the way we thought it happened. All you can do is report what you know at the time. And it may, Anita Alvarez, Cook County State's attorney, said she's going to open up an investigation on the second case. That may be one where we just never know. We never find out what the truth is. All you can do in a case like that is report it as you go along and be as skeptical about the people that you trust as you are about the people that maybe you don't.
When your mother says she loves you.
Check it out.
Yeah. So let's change gears a little bit, talking about politics and what's happening in Washington. Now that we've avoided this latest go-round with the fiscal cliff, do you want to make any prognostications? Do you think we're going to be in the same boat come January or February?
I think there's a high probability of that, unfortunately. And I think Patty Murray in the Democratic Party and Paul Ryan in the Republican Party are about as good as it gets in their respective parties. And we met with Paul Ryan just a few months ago, but he wasn't very confident that they would be able to find some kind of agreement. So I think they may be able to find a small bore agreement to get them past this that would include some adjustment in the forced spending cuts, the sequester that we have now. I think it's unlikely that they're going to come up with a grand bargain, and not necessarily because of political mistrust, but because they are so far apart philosophically on where they want to go that it's hard to see Republicans agreeing to.
Do they really need a grand bargain? I mean, is that necessary? Can't they get incremental improvements?
I think you need a grand bargain eventually. I mean, you look at where we are. We're about $17 trillion in debt now. Now the Democrats are saying that's coming. The deficit is coming down, and for the last couple of years, it has been about
by a lot, by like 60%.
But 2 or 3 years out, it flies again, largely because of entitlement and health care spending. So that's not what people are not looking at, is that this is almost the aberration the last couple of years as we've seen the reduction, partly because of the sequester, the forced spending cuts. So yeah, I do think in time that you do need to have a grand bargain, and it has to be on that entitlement spending.
But if it's politically impossible, as it seems now, and I know even things that seem politically impossible sometimes somehow get done, but can't the two parties, in classic negotiation, when you've got two parties who are very far apart, no matter what the conflict is, you try to find little bits around the edge that you can agree on. And maybe there's a huge elephant in the room that you don't address, but you try to get what you can.
Every once in a while they shock you. Dan Rostenkowski and Ronald Reagan, were able to make a deal.
They made it work.
And that was essentially on entitlement spending. It's almost what you need is a deal that's mutual assured destruction.
That the sequester was supposed to be that.
That puts everybody at risk. Right. And so nobody thought the sequester would ever happen. That nobody
it was so awful.
Possibly accept that. But it is what is that, and reductions in Medicare, which were part of Obamacare, are helping to drive down some of the costs.
So do you think if they can't reach a bargain, and we find ourselves in the same position come January, February, is it just a political bargaining chip to be able to say, well, we're going to make the country default on its debts? Is that a reasonable political position? I mean, the people opposed to that call them extremists and say this is crazy.
It was a terrible political decision for Republicans, and it was bad. Economically, it was a bad decision. I mean, we've written about this. The gross national product, the economic growth of the country took a hit. It would have taken a much bigger hit if there had been an actual default. But the uncertainty, and this is, I think, one reason why you're seeing business leaders sort of trying to shake the Republican Party and say, no, you can't go here.
This, yeah.
You can't go here. I think I think Obamacare has helped create some uncertainty on cost of benefits, and I think the Republicans playing this game of chicken has created as much uncertainty. And so I did talk to a lot of business leaders saying they're driving us crazy.
But they have a lot of influence, right? I mean, they fund a lot of
Well, they used to.
Right?
You would have thought so. Now they're talking about getting involved, and this is where you get close to civil war, right? If business leaders get involved in saying, all right, we need to get involved in Republican primaries running against Tea Party Republicans, that's a dicey thing politically to do. But it does seem like some business leaders at least are saying we need to get there.
I just read an article just the other day about comparing Ted Cruz, the Tea Party leader in the Senate, to Joseph McCarthy, and talking about the same level of disruption and irresponsibility in terms of the country's overall health. Is that a fair comparison? Do you think that has water?
I think we need disruptors. I mean, I don't have a problem with having some bomb throwers, figurative bomb throwers in politics. Eugene McCarthy was. You know, I mean, you see them on the left and the right, and so they do serve a purpose. In this case, you created this economic uncertainty that was damaging. But I think we saw in Vietnam, you know, the first political leaders who started to question Vietnam were seen as the ones who were off the reservation from their party. We wound up finding that they're right. I think the folks, you know, Cruz made terrible political calculations on this, but those folks are right on the debt issue, and so, you know, I would encourage them in that sense. You can't, you know, a status quo going along, adding $1 trillion, $500 billion a year in debt, I think would be a mistake. So their mistake in that case was pinning it all on Obamacare. Now, I think what you're also seeing is, and people are starting to realize, is that they kind of let Obamacare get a pass for a couple of weeks.
Did it ever?
couple of weeks.
And it would have been front page. Well, now it's back on the front page, but it would have been front page news for weeks had it not been for this government shutdown.
Yeah, and this is a very tenuous moment for the president. I think it is his signature accomplishment. And I've talked to Olympia Snow a year or so ago. Here's a Republican, a moderate Republican, who was willing to work with both parties on health care. And she tells a very harrowing story about sort of trying to, who's going to be there in the middle, and finding that on both sides, nobody wanted to do it. And
and that the middle was the most dangerous place?
Well, she was alone. It was just, it was a lonely place. And because she couldn't find Republicans, but Republicans quickly decided they weren't going to negotiate on this, and Democrats wanted nothing to do with Republicans. Now, Rahm Emanuel, mayor of Chicago, former White House chief of staff, has said publicly that he encouraged Democrats that you needed Republican votes on this, that if you passed this, however you did it, with Democratic votes. And you remember, it got a little seedy.
It did, yeah.
Close to
there's some parliamentary maneuvers necessary to get that through.
Right, but he said the danger, the political danger then is you own it. There's no Republican that owns Obamacare, and they're acting like that right now.
Of course, the hindsight being 2020, would it have been possible to get Republicans on board? I mean, at that point, it was
I
felt
think that's where Olympia Snow is going to say, no, you might have had one, you might have had
right.
two, but she found that both parties, basically she finds both parties culpable in the failure to find any kind of bipartisanship on health care at that time.
So let's shift gears, because you talked for a moment about President Obama being in a very tenuous position. The other thing that's becoming tenuous, something else that was knocked off the front pages but is now back, is the NSA spying. And we keep hearing revelations. You know, were they really tapping German Chancellor Angela Merkel's cell phone? Well, you know, we don't know. They haven't been quite forthcoming in that. How big a problem is that for the White House right now? Is it going to get better or worse?
So how do you balance, were they tapping Angela Merkel's phone, or were they tapping 300 million Americans' phones? I think we are, this was an issue with other governments as well. My sense is, from talking to diplomatic folks, that they're not quite as upset. They do sort of expect some of this. They're going to expect spying. I went to the CIA one time. They have a museum inside the CIA. You can't get to see it, but they do have a museum at the CIA if you ever get to tour, and it's fascinating. And one of the things on display is a big American eagle emblem. And when the U.S. opened an embassy in Moscow, the Russians gave them this big emblem, and they put it over the hearth, and they scanned it, and they tried to make sure everything was clear. It was bugged. So for years, the Russians had a microphone in the U.S. embassy. So how upset are we really about it? We have it on display at the CIA museum now.
Well, in fact, Mike Royko once famously said in one of his columns that he thought spying was the best thing that anybody could do, because he said, you know, when do you get really crazed? When do countries go to war? It's when you don't know what the other guys are up to. And so he said, open the floodgates. Let's spy on everybody. Let them spy on us. If you know what they're up to, you're not scared.
Yeah. So I mean, I think the debate we really ought to be having is on what was happening domestically, and was there value in that? Is metadata gathering problematic to the American people or not? The rest of it is just sort of the diplomatic stuff has just kind of got you more fun.
Well, how would the U.S. react if it were clear that Germany was tapping President Obama's personal cell phone?
I think they'd probably assume that anybody would try. If you had the means to do it, you're going to try and do it. You know, we know you can assume Iran is, North Korea is, enemies of the state are. It's a little more problematic when you're doing it to your friends.
Right.
But I would imagine during the Cold War, you know, we gathered whatever information that we could.
Well, speaking of that, a lot of these revelations, of course, are coming out of Mr. Snowden's revelations. So, as a newspaper person, you know, there's a debate, of course, was Edward Snowden a traitor? Is he a hero? You know, and usually with these cases, the truth is somewhere in the middle, as it so often is. But what's the newspaper reaction to this? This is valuable information. You yourself said, what's the debate about the 300 million Americans being spied on? So
it's a really tough thing for newspapers because we rely on whistleblowers. We rely on people who are willing to take a risk and put out information. What happens in a case like that is you know, the old school model was the newspaper made the decision on whether you released that information or not. The New York Times had to make a decision on the Pentagon papers and take a risk of going to jail. Now there's so many actors, different players involved.
And different
that
media.
you had the Guardian involved, you had the Washington Post involved. The Post says it is, you know, released information from Snowden, but there's a lot of information it hasn't released. So in one sense, the Post is putting out information that was classified, and on the other sense, it's withholding information that's classified. And so I guess you got to decide whether you trust the Washington Post on this. Does Snowden have the means at this point to say, you know, they're holding up stuff I don't think they ought to, and release that?
It doesn't sound like he's in a position to do that now, though we don't know.
No, and I don't think there's any question that if he is turned over to the U.S., he will be tried. I would think that how that ultimately is resolved would depend on part was he an enemy of the state, or was he releasing classified information? And you could treat them a little differently because we know there have been valid leaks. We know the government classifies a lot of stuff, more stuff,
and the government leaks its own
classifies the directions to the washroom. You know, they don't. Yeah. And I think, you know, we're seeing that there was a lot of value in the information that's come out in this case.
We only have a few minutes left, but on the subject of whistleblowers, you know, there's Edward Ricin, a reporter for the New York Times, who's being who was subpoenaed.
James
Ricin. Okay.
Yeah.
On a leaker case, and so the Obama administration seems to be much more virulent in its prosecution of leakers than any previous administration. We only got about 30 seconds. What is that good? Is that bad?
Are you shocked at that? Are you shocked at that?
Somewhat. Yeah.
I am too, and I think we've encouraged them to say, no, you don't need to. You really don't need to do this. You know, concentrate on the cases that are really where information that's valuable to U.S. enemies is coming out. I think it's the danger when they come after reporters, and look, I got a self-serving purpose here, is that you don't just chill the specific information, you chill the reporting,
the process
of reporting. And if you chill that sufficiently, you have a far more dangerous situation than occasional leaks of information.
Bruce, thanks so much for coming back. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us once again on Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. You can find us every Saturday night at 8 on Comcast Channel 19 and on the web at publicperspective.tv. So until next time, thank you and good night.